I never imagined that a small sign on clothing could change everything and reveal a mystery that no one had noticed. This was, without a doubt, my most unexpected case as a forensic doctor. An elderly man was found lifeless in his home, with no clear signs of accident or violence. Everything seemed simple, just another natural death. But something about his clothes made me doubt that small clue invisible to everyone else. What I discovered from there taught me that every body has a hidden story waiting to be heard. I am Dr. Ricardo Velasquez, a forensic physician in Santiago, Chile. I have been working in this field for over 15 years, where every case brings its own enigmas. But there are times when the truth jumps out from unexpected places, like this time. Before I begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. It was a typical morning at the forensic service when we received the body of Mr. Eduardo Munoz, a 78-year-old man, apparently deceased from natural causes. There were no signs of violence or trauma, nor obvious indications of a serious illness at first glance. The family had called because they hadn't heard from him for 2 days. The scene at his home was simple, almost impeccable for someone his age. No sign of a struggle or accident that indicated anything unusual. However, while examining his body for the routine protocol, something caught my attention on his shirt, a small stain that looked like a torn thread on the side. Insignificant to many, but to me, a signal. That small irregularity broke the pattern that the scene seemed to show. I decided to investigate his clothing more thoroughly, something I rarely do in such detail in seemingly natural deaths. Upon closer inspection, the small tear in the fabric revealed marks that looked like remnants of metallic thread, as if something had caught or dragged on it before his death. I wondered, could this have caused his death? Or perhaps it concealed an accident no one had suspected. This led me to inspect the room with different eyes. Few details seemed out of place, but a slight disorder in the corner where the man rested began to look suspicious. A chair was overturned, and a few objects on the floor were slightly displaced, but nothing that had caught the staff's attention at the time of discovery. The autopsy revealed something unexpected, a slight internal injury to a rib, which would not have been detectable without a thorough search. This injury could tell a different story than what we saw at the scene. But the most revealing came from the toxicology exam, which confirmed the presence of a medication at concentrations that did not match his medical history. Apparently, he had ingested a drug contraindicated for his age and condition, which could have affected his physical stability. All this led me to a different hypothesis. A silent fall and an unexpected medical complication, disguised under the appearance of a natural death. That tiny sign on the shirt was a key that allowed me to open the door to a truth invisible to all. Thanks to that detail, the family was able to better understand what really happened and prevent errors in the medical care of the elderly man from repeating. I want you to remember that every body, no matter how lifeless it seems, carries its own story, and sometimes those stories are told in the smallest and seemingly insignificant details. This case reminded me of a fundamental lesson. Never underestimate what a simple observation can bring. Sometimes, what no one sees can be what changes the whole story. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to give it a like. And subscribe for more real tales from the morgue, where every death has a message and every case a mystery to solve. Tell me in the comments if you have ever noticed a detail that others overlooked and what you think we are missing to see every day. See you in the next episode. When I arrived at the residence, everything seemed calm and uncomplicated. The victim, an elderly man, lay in his bed, in a room that seemed frozen in time. Framed family photos, an open Bible on the nightstand, his glasses carefully placed. Nothing out of place. At first glance, a heart failure or natural causes death seemed the most logical explanation. However, as I have always learned, appearances can be deceiving. While my team carried out the usual initial procedures, I closely observed the man's clothing. It was something minimal, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, a small stain very faint, as if someone had brushed a dark substance along the edge of a garment. It was neither blood nor common ink, but a dense substance that seemed to dry slowly over time, located precisely in an area often overlooked, the area under the shirt cuff, near the wrist edge. That small sign piqued my curiosity. What could it mean? A detail left by chance or a vital clue? My intuition urged me to dig deeper. I decided to request a sample of that substance, asking the laboratory for a specific analysis. While waiting for the results, I mentally reviewed every step and every person who had had contact with the man in the days prior. No one reported accidents or suspicious visits, and his neighbors, though concerned, confirmed they had seen him well during the last week. Yet, something still did not fit. The analysis confirmed something unexpected. That small stain contained traces of a chemical compound not found in the home nor in the man's body. It was a rare toxicological compound linked to a specific type of irritant agent that could cause silent internal damage. That's when a second, far more disturbing twist in the investigation surfaced. Searching for this compound at typical scenes was a mistake, but that mark on the shirt proved that the body had been in direct or indirect contact with the substance. I then decided to look beyond the body, exploring every corner of the apartment, even those spots normally avoided out of routine or lack of time. It was in the kitchen, under the sink, where I found something suspicious. A small unlabeled bottle, sealed but with blurry remains of the same compound I had detected. Who had left it there? Was it a household product or something else? This led me to reconsider all previous hypotheses and imagine a possibility that made me uneasy. This was not an accident. Suddenly, I began recalling some details about the man's personality that I may never have taken into account. He was reserved, yes, but had a certain passion for gardening and natural medicine. Could he have tried to self-medicate with something inappropriate, something that could have hastened his death without obvious signs? That idea, which initially seemed plausible, was only another layer of what was beginning to become a much more complex puzzle. As the investigation progressed, conversations with family members revealed something that had not come up initially. It seemed that in recent weeks, the elderly man had been experiencing episodes of confusion and forgetfulness, but had rejected medical help. More unsettlingly, a close relative mentioned he had refused visits from people who usually supported him, something unusual for someone who had always been sociable. In my observations of the body, the autopsy proved far more revealing than I had anticipated. There were no evident wounds or traumatic injuries, but there were internal signs indicating severe inflammation in the lungs and progressive deterioration of certain organs. The most enigmatic finding was the discovery of tiny microscopic particles in the lung tissue, which, after specialized analysis, matched the same chemical material found in the stain and the bottle. Suddenly, the picture became clear. That compound had not only been in contact with the skin, but had been inhaled or absorbed somehow, severely affecting his health and causing a progressive lethal effect. This finding gave the case a definitive twist, as now we could no longer talk about only a natural or accidental death. It was necessary to investigate the origin and purpose of that chemical. Was someone else involved? Or had the man administered the substance to himself intentionally? The answer was not simple, but I knew I was getting closer to a truth many would want to hide. I returned to interview the neighbors with renewed attention, asking especially about strange visitors or unusual behavior. It was then that a neighbor told me that in recent days she had noticed odd movements in the neighboring apartment, a man who had rented the property recently. She began to feel uneasy, as the noises and gestures seemed different from usual, and something in her tone when telling me this anecdote confirmed my growing suspicion that an external element was related to the toxic substance. I decided to request permission to inspect the neighboring apartment, and, upon entering, the atmosphere was decidedly unsettling. There I found several samples of chemical products, some illegal and dangerous, as well as equipment that could be used to manufacture highly harmful compounds. There were clear indications that someone was experimenting with chemical substances, possibly with illicit or unclear purposes. The fact that this person could have had contact with the elderly man escalated the case to a completely new level. From that moment, my work turned into a race against time and bureaucracy. Every new piece of information required confirmation. Every suspect needed to be interviewed, and every scenario had to be reconstructed with forensic and police precision. The small detail on the sleeve of a shirt, something that would have gone unnoticed by almost everyone, had become the key that opened a door no one expected. Every body I examine reminds me that death does not always present itself like a fallen tree easily recognizable. There are hidden roots, small signs that originate in the most unsuspected places, and if one does not have the patience to see them or the courage to follow them, the case remains superficial, comfortable. My experience in that apartment and that case taught me that behind every seemingly insignificant thing, no matter how small, there is a story screaming to be discovered. I cannot help but think about that man and how, with a small mark on his clothing, he managed to tell a story that would otherwise have been silenced forever. It was those small signs, those footprints invisible to most, that indicated to me that the truth is not always in what it seems, but in what someone unintentionally left for someone else to find. And even though sometimes reality is uncomfortable and the answers are not always what we want, my job is to listen to every body, every sign, because no detail is too small when it comes to uncovering the truth. As I crossed the threshold of that neighboring apartment, I felt a mixture of unease and concentration wash over me. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the very air held secrets barely contained. The walls, marked by stains and palpable wear, seemed to whisper stories of a recent past, twisted and disturbed. The smell was strong, penetrating, a mix of chemicals, and something more indefinable, darker. It was not the typical scent of an ordinary home. It was a smell of obsession and secrecy. As my steps advanced slowly, every corner revealed signs of an improvised laboratory, bottles with liquids of different colors, test tubes filled with bubbling substances, powder scattered over poorly used tables, and tools apparently designed for the careful handling of compounds. Some of these products seemed harmless, but others were undoubtedly dangerous and uncommon, and far from suitable for a normal residence in an apartment building. There were boxes labeled with names I didn't recognize, warnings partially erased, and notes hastily scribbled on crumpled papers. I wondered how someone could live like that, surrounded by so much risk, and most importantly, what was the connection to the victim? With each discovery, the tension inside me grew. The case seemed to be taking a definite direction, but not without risks. I knew that behind that place and its secrets was probably the key to understanding not only how the old man had died, but why. Coming across that space made me think of the victim's vulnerability. Someone who seemingly led a quiet life, but who might have been more exposed than anyone could imagine. I decided to take photographs and samples, documenting everything carefully to leave nothing to chance. I couldn't allow haste or routine to make me overlook a single detail. Beyond the scene, I was concerned that the neighbor, whose identity would take time to clarify, was involved in dangerous activities, and perhaps unknowingly had compromised the elderly man's life. That idea was disturbing, but had to be approached objectively. While waiting for their personal security and mine to be guaranteed, I recalled the words of a mentor from my early years as a forensic doctor. The most important answers are not in what is obvious, but in the gray areas, in what the ordinary I cannot or will not see. Patience and curiosity are the best tools of the forensic expert. That thought comforted me and drove me to move forward with determination. On one of the shelves, I found an old notebook bound in leather with pages full of notes. Unable to resist, I opened it with respect and caution. There I found records, formulas, and references to substances with complex names, mixtures that explained the presence of the toxic compound and its potential lethality. It was clear that whoever lived there had advanced knowledge, and their experiments could have direct consequences on others, perhaps even on the victim who, unwittingly, might have been exposed or used as part of some experiment or confrontation. Each page was more unsettling than the last. Some notes mentioned methods to absorb chemical substances through the skin and clear warnings on how to avoid detection. One line, almost hidden, spoke of the mark that will betray, the trace no one will see, and I immediately thought of that faint stain on the old man's shirt. Everything was starting to fit, but there was also an abyss of unknowns to resolve. Why had this man, with a fondness for gardening and natural medicine, been so close to someone involved in such dark activities? Was he a naive neighbor, an accidental victim, or part of something much deeper? Suddenly, the clamor of voices in the hallway jolted me back to reality. More police arrived, and a face I hadn't expected appeared on the scene. The deceased nephew. His expression was one of confusion mixed with worry, asking what was happening and why there was so much activity. At that moment, His reaction seemed genuine, but it was also an invitation to delve deeper into the family dynamics. He was reluctant, evasive to simple questions, but I persisted patiently to have him tell me everything he knew about his uncle's last weeks. What I discovered was a disturbing shadow of silence, conflict, and guarded secrets. The elderly man, besides suffering episodes of confusion, had differences with certain relatives, especially that nephew. He didn't want visits, didn't want help, and had shown a strange fear towards strangers, including residents of the new apartment. That information seemed to confirm my suspicions. It wasn't only a medical issue, but also an intricate web of personal relationships and possible hidden conflicts. Returning to the autopsy, the forensic analysis of the chemical particles gave me surprising technical data. The substance not only damaged internal organs, but left a kind of molecular signature almost impossible to hide. The small stain on the clothing worked as direct evidence of contact, but what was inside the man's body at the cellular level was irrefutable proof. This implied that the deceased had been in repeated or prolonged contact with that substance, contact that was not casual and required a specific environment to maintain and spread. As the pieces of the puzzle fit together, a question nagged me. How long had he been exposed? Had he lived weeks or months with that silent damage growing inside him until it finally overwhelmed him? Had the man realized, or was it confusion, he showed partly the toxic effect? That level of uncertainty was distressing but also motivating. The work had just begun, and we had to be cautious not to lose track of the thread that the clothing, the improvised laboratory, and the testimonies had woven together. At every step, I felt the pressure mounting. It was not just about clarifying a death, but protecting the community, identifying whether a latent risk existed for other neighbors, and the possibility that someone was handling dangerous substances so close, affecting others without permission or control, gave me a feeling as unsettling as it was personal. The mix of forensic technology, medical intuition, and human empathy was essential at that moment to not lose the trail. In the following days, the investigation expanded, involving toxicology specialists, special police units, and social workers. No one wanted to leave loose ends, and every suspicion had to be rigorously verified. I received multiple calls and cross messages, testimonies that sometimes contradicted each other, rumors trying to discredit the team's work. But I knew the truth always finds a way to surface, and my role was to be patient and persistent, just as that small stain had taught me. That night, returning home with my mind full of details, I couldn't help but imagine that elderly man sitting in his room, surrounded by memories, unaware that an invisible threat was undermining his life. I wondered how many other stories, equally hidden and silent, roamed among us, waiting for someone attentive to finally hear them. That reflection reminded me why I chose this profession. Because every human being deserves for their story to be told with respect. Because even in death, dignity and truth beat more strongly than ever. As I closed my eyes before sleep, the image of the shirt cuff, with that barely perceptible stain, was firmly imprinted in my memory. It was a reminder that in the science of death, the smallest clue can be the light that illuminates the darkest darkness, and that often justice and truth depend on the attentive gaze of someone willing not to settle for the apparent, to seek patiently, and to listen when everyone else is silent, no matter how invisible it seemed or how insignificant the evidence appeared. Sometimes, the most unexpected sign is the one that changes the course of a story. And in my case, on that occasion, a small stain on a sleeve was a silent echo that exposed a much more complex and dangerous reality, proving that in forensic work, nothing, not even the tiniest detail, can be ignored. After that first encounter with the scene in the neighbor's apartment, I slowly returned to more with my mind tangled in hypotheses and scattered details. The image of the old leather notebook, with those almost encrypted formulas and notes, kept spinning like a stuck wheel. It wasn't an ordinary case, that was clear. The toxic substance had left its mark in more ways than one, and the small stain on the elderly man's clothing began to take on a terrifying dimension. It was not just a trace, but evidence of direct and perhaps prolonged contact, which started to raise the possibility that we were facing an act that was not only accidental but intentional. The following day passed wrapped in tense silence, phones ringing intermittently, calls in the laboratory, and at the same time, meetings with the investigation team. We moved from theory to practice, analyzing the chemical samples, cross-referencing their composition with national and international databases, searching for any comparison points that could help us better understand that strange mixture. Preliminary toxicology results arrived quickly. What seemed like an experimental compound, with components almost unknown to the common scientific community, had a slow, almost stealthy mode of action. It was a time bomb that had been wreaking havoc on the victim's body for weeks or even months. As I reviewed the reports, I found myself thinking about the victim's profile. A man who loved his garden, avoided conflicts, and preferred tranquility. Something in that contrast with the dark shadow of the neighbor and his strange substances hit me hard. It was almost impossible that the elderly man had been exposed without knowing it. But then, how? What was the route? Was it the air, a shared object, casual contact, or perhaps something else? The idea that he had been in danger, without being aware of it, shook me deeply. I remembered seeing a couple of flower pots on the elderly man's window. Could there be something there? The next day, I returned to the place with the police's permission and the intention of looking more closely. Among the objects, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tiny traces of fine dust, almost invisible, as if it were a powder that had been spread and adhered to the plants and the pot itself. I took samples and left the place with a growing feeling that this dust was related to the substance we had found in the adjacent laboratory. With the evidence in hand, I requested an urgent consultation with an environmental chemistry specialist. The explanation I received was unsettling. That dust contained residues of the toxic compound, capable of adhering to organic surfaces and, through indirect contact, transfer into the skin without the victim noticing. It was a true invisible bridge connecting the victim with the threat. The prolonged exposure, though involuntary, had slowly seeped into his body asymptomatically until it finally manifested as irreversible damage. This revelation forced us to look at the environment with new perspective. Understand that the death had not been solely the product of direct contact, but part of a complex scheme involving the intentional dissemination of that substance. We began gathering testimonies from other neighbors, attended to detecting if anyone else had experienced strange symptoms or noticed peculiar smells. The responses ranged from absolute denial to restrained fear expressed in private conversations. The palpable nervousness clearly reflected that no one had been completely unaware of what was happening. In a meeting with the deceased nephew, the conversation turned tenser. It seemed the initial reluctance came from a place deeper than mere surprise at the investigation. His cautious, almost offensive attitude began to raise suspicions. I remembered he had mentioned the family had been estranged and that in recent months he had had a serious disagreement with his uncle over financial matters. The possibility of a conflict that went beyond the superficial became something that needed exploring. I decided to speak with the detectives handling the criminal side and suggested an approach to analyze the nephew's financial movements and contacts during that period. Although everything seemed professional and legitimate on the surface, when behavior is examined closely, there are always details that previously went unnoticed. Those inquiries, amid the coldness of analysis, began to reveal out-of-place movements, unusual transactions, and cryptic communications with people who, according to police records, were linked to illicit activities, including the purchase of chemicals and controlled substances. The complexity of the case thickened by the minute. Not only were we dealing with conscious or unconscious exposure to lethal material, but the family and neighborhood environment seemed wrapped in tensions and silences woven between truth and lies. The victim, that person who seemed oblivious to everything, was inextricably tied to this dangerous web around the neighbor and the experiments. It was not simply an accident, nor an isolated attack. It was a web that required patience to unravel each thread. In the afternoon, while delving into microscopic analyses of the victim's skin and clothing, I was able to confirm something I believed possible but needed to see with my own eyes. Particles of the toxic compound were not only on the surface, but had penetrated deep layers, leaving traces of perpetuity. This reinforced the idea of repeated and constant exposure, not a single event. How had this contact persisted without anyone noticing? And why? Questions without immediate answers, but that kept the urgency of the investigation alive. I decided to visit the neighbor's apartment once more, this time accompanied by specialized personnel. The warrant had been obtained from a judge to proceed with a proper search of the place, continue ordered evidence collection, and avoid contamination. As soon as we crossed the threshold, the heavy atmosphere enveloped us again, this time accompanied by the certainty that we were entering a nest of secrets yet unrevealed. The discovery of more jars, documents with coded notes, and hidden electronic devices provided us with new information about the nature of the experiments, the possible illegal manufacturing, and the real intention behind the work, to create an agent capable of going unnoticed but lethal, with purposes we still didn't know. The analysis of the digital devices revealed encrypted communications with people internationally, involving a network much larger than a simple obsessed neighbor. Evidently, our case touched on matters that exceeded the local scope and that might involve lives beyond a deceased elderly man. The mixture of dangerous chemistry and clandestine relationships made this a plot worthy of a movie, but with real and devastating consequences. That very night, in the deceptive tranquility of my office, I reviewed every detail as I took notes and wrote down possible connections to investigate. The stain on the sleeve, invisible to many, had become the key that opened the door to a much deeper and more complex story. I thought about the fragility of the human being and how sometimes, unknowingly, we can be on the edge of invisible dangers that only an attentive eye can discover. I thought of the elderly man in his garden, that space that seemed refuge and peace, and how, deep down, the environment had conspired to break that calm. The silent death was not only hidden in a chemical substance, but also in the human relationships that had either protected or ignored a threat, and in the indifference of community that never thought something like this could happen at their very doorstep. The lesson was harsh but clear. In our world, what seems small and insignificant can have the power to change lives. As I finished organizing the material for the next day, I paused to think about the future of the investigation. I knew there was still much to discover, many layers to peel back before reaching the bottom. Satisfaction and unease mix inevitably, but I was also sure of something. That small stain was the unexpected sign that pushed us not to settle, not to accept the superficial, and always to look beyond. Because in the end, in this profession, respect for the truth and for the dignity of those who can no longer speak is what keeps us firm and drives us to keep digging into the invisible. That night, as silence surrounded me, images of the laboratory, the notebook, the stain, and the elderly man's calm face blended in my mind. I had learned once again that in death and in life, the tiniest details hold powerful stories, and that listening to them can be the difference between forgetting or making justice. What seemed like just another case became a reflection of a much more complex reality, of a world where nothing can be taken for granted, and where patience, curiosity, and empathy are essential weapons. And so, with that certainty, I prepared to continue, aware that at every step lurked a new sign, a hidden answer, a truth waiting to be uncovered. Because in this uncertain work, the unexpected is the only constant, and justice is a goal that deserves all our effort, even when the truth hides the most imperceptible stain. The investigation progressed with slow, almost clumsy steps, but every move we made seemed to unravel the knot we were trapped in a little more. That stain, which at first seemed like a minor detail, was like a faint beacon in the midst of a dense fog, showing us a path that grew darker and more complicated. Between the work with the environmental chemistry team and conversations with the detectives, I began to notice how the atmosphere around the case filled with silent, almost palpable tension. The neighbors, once so distant, started to look on with suspicion. There were faces I thought I knew but that held secrets, silences that became impenetrable walls. One day, while reviewing some digital files recovered from a neighbor's apartment, I noticed something that hadn't caught my attention before, a calendar marked with certain dates, on which brief but clear notes appear about experiments and deliveries. The word deliveries raised an alarm. It wasn't just a chemist obsessed with his clandestine lab. There was something more, a business, a network involving more people than we had imagined, perhaps a large-scale distribution network. And not just any product, but an agent designed to go unnoticed, causing invisible and prolonged harm. It was almost impossible not to imagine the implications. This was not just a covered-up murder. It could mean a threat to the entire community. The thought hit me hard. How many more could be victims, unknowingly exposed? Slowly, that idea began to weigh on me like an impossible burden to ignore. I thought again about those flower pots and the nearly invisible dust. How many hands had touched that substance? How many people had inhaled it without realizing it? The answers were still scarce, but every small clue confirmed that the victim had not been the only one. The physical and emotional where it began to be part of the daily routine. Every sample, every interview, was a battle against exhaustion and uncertainty, as if it tried to overwhelm the team to make us give up. But too much was at stake to retreat. On one of those long nights at the morgue, while examining tissues and cells more closely, a new surprise appeared. A type of organic reaction I had never seen before caused by the toxic substance. It was not only poisonous, it was active in the body, modifying processes we still didn't understand. This could explain why the victim seemed healthy until weeks before. The damage progressed silently, adapting and hiding within the body itself. A kind of invisible and ruthless enemy. Could it be that this substance was experimental because no one had seen it before? Could it be from a clandestine lab with ambitions to create a biochemical product? Something that crossed that forbidden line? Each of those questions opened unsettling doors. In that moment, I realized the scope of the case went beyond our usual reach. As toxicology advanced, the interrogations of neighbors suggesting symptoms and unexplained small accidents began to make sense. The community was under a silent test, unaware, exposed to a chemical threat that had infiltrated their daily routine. It was impossible to ignore the contrast between the neighborhood's apparent normality and the seriousness of the danger they were exposed to. Some people began to show fear, withdrawing from conversations or disappearing when the case became public. There was, undoubtedly, a tension growing like a collective secret. Amid all this, the nephew flew under the radar, although his financial movements and contacts raised suspicions. Two parallel worlds. One, the older man enjoying his peace, and the other, the nephew and neighbor, entangled in chemicals, shady businesses, and coded messages. One afternoon, while the sun sadly filtered to the laboratory window where we were reviewing the analyses, I received an unexpected call. It was an encrypted text message sent from an unknown number, containing a link to a short video. In that moment, my heart raced. It was uncommon to receive strange communications in the middle of the investigation, except from people linked to the network we were trying to expose. I decided to watch it cautiously. The video showed blurry, low-quality footage of a hooded figure handling small vials of a powder similar to that found in the neighbor's apartment. A distorted, barely audible voice spoke in the background about the next step and leaving no visible traces. The message was clear. Someone was monitoring the investigation, sending veiled warnings. That revelation made me understand that we were playing on dangerous ground. The reality of the case was no longer just chemical or legal. It was a matter of personal safety. The feeling of being watched began to sink into the team and me, and I knew we had to act more cautiously, neither rushing nor wasting time. I became aware that the power behind this network was much greater than we thought, and that our discretion was essential to avoid endangering more people. The following days were marked by clandestine meetings, exchanges of information with specialized agencies abroad, and a collective effort to piece together fragments in a mosaic that wouldn't fully come together. One of the most valuable leads came when an anonymous witness came forward with a revealing account. They had seen the nephew arguing heatedly with a masked individual in a nearby park. About what they debated, the witness could only say it involved codes and strange names, but clearly related to the delivery and distribution of products. That lead provided us with a new map of dark zones, figures, and names that had previously been just shadows. With that information, the detectives began to make more aggressive moves, monitoring communications and watching possible exchange points. Meanwhile, in the lab, the substance underwent deeper analyses. The compound, now clearly identified as a neurotoxic agent designed to infiltrate tissues without leaving visible traces, had the ability to slowly incapacitate anyone exposed. It was not only lethal but also progressively altered cognitive functions, explaining numerous cases where neighbors had suffered mild fainting, confusion, and unexplained pains, symptoms they attributed to simple health issues but which now seemed part of the malicious mechanism. At times, the story felt like a suspense novel or a spy thriller. The network not only distributed the substance, it also tried to ensure it was used in specific ways, possibly as a weapon or to manipulate certain individuals. The idea was terrifying and entirely real. the line between science and crime dangerously blurred. Meanwhile, the face of the deceased elderly man in his immaculate garden remained in my memory as a clear symbol of what we were facing. A life sacrificed without permission, a silent soul who, perhaps unknowingly, had paved the way for a truth that went far beyond death. The nephew's figure became even more central as we began detecting suspicious financial movements from his account to suppliers of control materials. Some transfers disguised as payments for services in places related to chemical activity. Despite his denial and fierce defense during questioning, the evidence grew, intertwining the plot in an inescapable way. The fragile line between family and suspect stretched like a thread about to break. One morning, while reviewing the lab report, the team leader called me urgently. "They found something," he said gravely. It turned out that in a package intercepted after delivery, among ordinary substances, a vial containing the same toxic compound, prepared and ready for distribution, had been found. It was a definitive confirmation. The network not only existed but was operational, and the death of the elderly man was just the first step in a much broader plan. The news hit me hard. I felt powerless and the pressure moved fast, but without making mistakes. The safety of many depended on our ability to dismantle that chain. I understood then that the stain on the old man's clothing, that small detail no one had noticed at first, was a key link that had allowed Pandora's box to be opened. It was a subtle but powerful sign that had guided us from darkness to the light of staggering truths. The reconstruction process was not easy. Every advance required patience, meticulousness, and a dose of courage that seemed to grow with each frustration. I began to understand even more the value of forensic work, not only as an exact science, but as an art that demands sensitivity to capture what is hidden, what the common eye fails to perceive. This experience made it clear that death, far from being a closed chapter, is often a beginning, an invitation to listen and discover the silent voices that only a few can interpret. I thought about the elderly man's family, their sadness, and the unexpected blows the investigation was causing. Nothing would ever be the same for them, and although the process was painful, it also offered a chance for justice. The justice that not only had to clear the old man's name, but also protect everyone from an evil hiding in plain sight. I felt them more committed than ever, aware that the story we were deciphering represented something bigger than an isolated case. It was a reflection of dangers lurking in the shadows of everyday life, invisible but present. At night, when all the lights went out and silence filled the morgue, I would meditate on that paradox. Life and death, apparent calm and hidden storm, the garden and the deadly substance. I knew there were still many pieces to fit together, that the road was far from over, but also that the search for truth was worth every effort, every sleepless night, every doubt. Because in that twisted and complex world, the only way to honor those who could no longer speak was to be silent instruments of justice. Thus, with the weight of responsibility beyond the professional, I prepared to continue the investigation. In that unsettling stillness of night, I understood that the unexpected had never left, that the lost sign was present in every corner, waiting to be discovered. Every stain, every particle, every silence held a story, and we were its voices. The search would continue, slow and steady, because sometimes the smallest thing is what opens the door to the greatest and most necessary truths. The news of the vial found in the intercepted package was like a bomb exploding in the middle of the laboratory. Suddenly, everything we'd been uncovering began to take on an even more real and terrifying dimension. We were not just facing a complex and well-organized network, but an immediate, tangible threat that was one step away from invading the lives of many innocent people. The litany of doubts and mysteries began to forcefully kick down the doors of reality. How many similar shipments had already been distributed? How many other prepared vials, like that one, were spreading uncontrollably across the city? I looked at the team, and on their faces, two opposing feelings were reflected. The soul of the scientist eager to understand more, to unravel the substance precisely, an awareness that this was dangerous, terrifying, a shadow threatening to swallow us all. The worst part was not knowing exactly how or when the damage might manifest. We knew about the neurotoxic agent, but the substance seemed to camouflage itself, hide, play with the time and biology of whoever was exposed. It was invisible, insidious, and therefore cruelly effective, The nights began to grow longer and heavier for me. A friend once told me that forensic work is like always standing on a cliff, looking down and fighting the fear of falling. That thick feeling accompanied me every time I reviewed those reports. Every time I revisited those images of the vial, the powder, the stains on the old man's clothes. The certainty that, despite all our efforts, someone outside was still moving pieces in the dark was like a force pushing me to continue. Even when every step seemed a challenge to exhaustion, the environment began to change. Some neighbors, previously indifferent to the case, now crossed the street quickly to avoid eye contact. Conversations, when they occurred, were brief and tense. There was an air of mutual surveillance, of someone fearing being watched but not knowing who or why. Paranoia began to weave itself into those silent spaces, into those cafes where warmth of the neighborhood was once shared. However, amid that climate, an unexpected facet emerged. Some neighbors began to seek my help, sharing episodes linked to strange sensations, sudden pains, or inexplicable dizziness. Small stories, almost invisible, but which, in light of what we were discovering, took on a gravity that shook you. It was in that tangle of small testimonies that I understood how deep the damage caused by this network was. It did not only represent a risk of immediate death, as with the initial victim, but a silent impact that was undermining the health and coherence of an entire community. An enemy that not only killed but fractured the social fabric with fear and uncertainty. And the worst part, many in their ignorance, were becoming carriers and victims simultaneously. While the laboratory delved deeper into studying the substance, clandestinely manufactured but with surprising level of sophistication, we continued with the intention of identifying its origin and, above all, the way to neutralize this threat. The compound showed a worrying adaptive capacity. It seemed to evolve inside the body, mutate, making it harder to detect and counteract. This characteristic added an almost desperate urgency to our work. We not only needed to capture those responsible, but also to stop the effect on those already compromised. A new twist arrived when genetic analysis found a kind of unique biochemical marker, a signature that seemed related to an old scientific investigation abandoned by the local university years ago for ethical and legal reasons. Curiously, the old man's nephew had been a student of that program. The connection began to take shape, revealing a series of coincidences that could no longer be ignored. The investigation not only touched the immediate present, it also had roots in dark projects and experiments believed archived, forgotten, or eliminated. At that moment, the nephew's figure stopped being just a suspect and became a fundamental link in the chain. Despite his attempts to deny any involvement, his trail became more visible with each small detail discovered. Phone calls to unknown numbers, hidden bank transactions, and frequent trips that didn't match his usual work. It was clear he was deeply involved and perhaps aware of the gravity of what was underway. But how far did his intentions go, and who else was behind it? That question haunted me until one night, in a perhaps impulsive act, I decided to visit again the apartment where it had all begun. I wanted to see the place with my own eyes, to walk through those spaces that had been silent witnesses to so many secrets. Upon entering, the air felt heavier, the dim light filtered through the curtains, and the silence seemed to weigh a ton. It was there, almost instinctively, that I found something previous analyses hadn't revealed. A tiny, nearly illegible inscription inside an old toolbox hidden under the desk. The inscription was a code, numeric and alphabetic, and a name that seemed familiar, a nickname heard in the intercepted conversations during the investigation. It represented a key, a password for something hidden, another link in a chain that seemed endless. Its discovery reignited the flame of hope, but also showed how tangled and complex the network we were facing was. It wasn't just an isolated case, but part of a larger web, perhaps with international ramifications. Shortly after, I received an unexpected visit from one of the agents assigned to the case. He brought fresh but disturbing news. A clandestine laboratory had been discovered on the outskirts of Santiago, a place where the substance was being manufactured with sophisticated equipment and at a much higher production level than we had anticipated. Evidence showed that the network did not only operate within the city, but had connections to distribute the compound to several strategic points across the country. The scale of the danger multiplied. Faced with that revelation, the pressure became unbearable. It was no longer just about delivering justice for a single victim, but about protecting an entire population unaware of the latent risk. The safety of the team and mine became a constant concern. Veiled threats grew more frequent, and furtive glances stopped being so furtive. That's when I understood we were dealing with an enemy willing to do anything to keep their operation secret, and that we were the only ones who could stop that machinery. Each step forward took us deeper into a world of shadows, where science mixed with crime and human life became mere input for dark interests. During those long days, searching for patterns, talking with international experts, and organizing strategies with detectives, I felt how the meaning of the investigation changed. It was not simply a search for culprits, but a battle against an evil hiding in the everyday. An invitation not to lower our guard, to listen to those signals that seem lost or mistaken, but which ultimately marked the way. The work, always exhausting, became a kind of obsession. Every piece of data added up, but also wore us down. Often, when leaving the laboratory, I noticed the city lights seemed a little less bright, as if the shadow we pursued extended beyond where we could see. There was a weight, an enormous responsibility. I could not fail, not just for the elderly man we had lost, but for all those who could still be affected. I remembered his calm eyes, the peace he seemed to enjoy in his garden before that cruel fate manifested. His death could not be in vain. And at that point, I understood something essential. In forensics, as in life, no detail is insignificant. That small stain on the clothing, so unnoticed by others, was a lantern that illuminated a path through darkness. Every particle, every whisper, every gesture hid a story. Our task was to have enough patience and respect to listen to those silent voices. Because sometimes the most unexpected thing can become the sign that changes the course of everything. That night, while reviewing the last reports and the city slept, I felt something inside me harden and at the same time open. The investigation continued and would continue, not as a formality, but as a commitment to truth, to justice, and to those still fighting unknowingly against invisible enemies. I knew the path was long and dangerous, that certainties are behind complex events, but also that in that tangle of doubts, we would find the necessary answers to save many lives. The case of the elderly man became for me a constant reminder of human fragility and the power of science when used to protect, not destroy. In a world where the hidden disguises itself as normality, it falls to us, those who listen death and its signals, to keep our eyes and ears alert, because that is a true legacy, to turn the small into truth and use that truth to light the darkest corners of our reality. And so, with each step, with each discovery, we will keep moving forward. Because in the pursuit of justice, there is no room for surrender. To end the following weeks, the investigation progressed at an almost relentless pace, yet at the same time with a slowness that felt like torture. Days blended into nights, and nights turned into long stretches of analysis, interrogations, and meticulous reviews. Every new piece of data that arrived could seem like an open door, or often a solid wall reminding us of the complexity and depth of the case. The tension within the team was palpable, like an electric current suspended in the air, ready to explode at any moment, and I felt that weight increasingly compressed in my chest. When we managed to confirm the direct link between the biochemical marker found in the victim's body and the data from that old university investigation, everything began to take a clearer shape, but at the same time, a more dangerous one. We realized that we were not only confronting a lethal substance in itself, but a technology created in an academic environment that, for reasons we still couldn't fully understand, had been abandoned and buried by its ethical implications. A project that promised medical advances, yes, but that could also become a lethal weapon, a trap hidden beneath the facade of science. I remember spending hours in front of those old reports, scrutinizing technical language mixed with handwritten notes and forgotten emails. It was like entering a forbidden archive, where the lines between good and evil, ambition and scientific arrogance blurred. The elderly man's nephew, who until that moment had seemed merely a family link, began to clearly show himself as a figure connecting those worlds. He had not only been a student in the program, but his trajectory intersected with some of the researchers involved in those experiments. This took away any innocence, although it also raised new, more disturbing questions. Was he involved only out of conviction for business, or was there something else? What did he know And when did he discover it? Was he perhaps the key piece that could lead us to the head of the monster? The few answers we managed to extract during interrogations didn't calm my doubts. Instead, they deepened them. The nephew not only denied any direct involvement, but also seemed to play a shadow game, avoiding details, giving evasive or contradictory answers. His attitude made it clear to me that behind that silence lay a greater secret, one he perhaps didn't want to reveal even to himself. Meanwhile, his movements, his contacts, and especially those trips without logical justification, became pieces of the puzzle. We were not facing a common criminal, but someone part of a much broader network. At the same time, the discovery of the clandestine laboratory was a brutal blow. That place was a factory of silent terror, a space frozen in time where the drug was produced with almost obsessive precision. The agents who took part in the raid described finding sophisticated equipment, chemical substances stored in special containers, and computers full of encoded data. It was a production center showing resources, contacts, and logistics beyond what we could imagine. Who financed this? Who was giving the orders? To what other levels had this network reached? But what impacted me most was the evidence that the substance was not only being manufactured there, but was already circulating around the city and probably in other areas. Through wiretaps and surveillance, we identified distribution points, some disguised as regular businesses, others so discreet they went completely unnoticed. This reality placed ordinary people, neighbors, thousands of individuals, in the line of fire without their knowledge. It was as if a toxic shadow slowly spread, infiltrating everyday life. And that thought filled me with an unavoidable anguish. It was then that the neighbor's account began to take on new meaning. Those small episodes, the sudden pains, the strange sensations, became increasingly palpable to me. In those voices, I found an echo of the substance, an invisible but constant trail that undermined health and spirit. I especially remember the visit of an elderly woman, Mrs. Martinez, who cried while explaining how, for weeks, she had felt unexplained weakness, dizziness, and breathing difficulties. Her testimony pushed us to organize checkups and tests on small samples from the community. We discovered that indeed, there was a real impact, silent yet deep, often going unnoticed or being attributed to common causes. This data changed our perspective. It was no longer just about capturing the perpetrators and supporting the direct victim, but about saving an entire community. It was a fight against an enemy who used shadows, who preferred stealth and invisibility, but whose mark was indelible. For this reason, we also began designing prevention campaigns, contact with health centers, and support networks to warn the population without causing panic, a delicate balance. My forensic work, although still key in the investigation, was complemented by a new task: listening to people, understanding their fears, and translating that information into action measures. Amidst all this whirlwind, I felt that physical and mental exhaustion was reaching its limits. The pressure was unbearable and the lack of certainty overwhelming. But at the same time, the case had kindled something in me, a flame that didn't allow me to give up. I recalled that small sign on the elderly man's clothing, a detail many would have overlooked, but which became the key to opening Pandora's box. That lesson never left me. Every clue, every fragment, no matter how tiny it seems, can be the key to understanding a much greater truth. One night, after many hours without rest, I decided to take a step that might border on madness, but that felt necessary. I returned to the elderly man's apartment, the very space that had revealed so many secrets to me. I wanted to better understand the environment in which that man had lived, the atmosphere surrounding him, which, in some way, had been the scene of an invisible tragedy. Silence was my companion, as I walked through those rooms that seemed suspended in time. The dirty curtains, the dust on the windows, the smell of confinement mixed with fragile memories made me feel close to that painful reality. It was then that, after searching thoroughly, I found that inscription in the toolbox. That alphanumeric code and the nickname sparked my intuition. I knew that this key could open another level of the mystery. It wasn't simply a name or password, but a sign that someone had left clues, intentionally or by accident. Within that inscription was an invitation for those seeking answers, a map hidden in symbols invisible to those who didn't know where to look. This discovery led us to track, that key in multiple databases, networks, and archives. We found connections with places, people, and undercover operations. The network grew increasingly large, and complicity extended to unsuspected sectors. It was not just a local case, but one involving matters that crossed borders and jurisdictions. The more we investigated, the clearer it became that we were facing a sophisticated web, with various layers and players using science as a mask for their intentions. Something beyond the scope of a simple criminal group. It seemed like a ruthless monster disguised by anonymity. The unexpected visit from the agent with news about the clandestine laboratory was a turning point. It showed us that the enemy did not hide in the smallest shadows, but in places where legal and moral boundaries blurred completely. That factory of silent death not only provided the substance, but had created a machinery capable of perpetuating horror with ruthless calculation. The business ties, hidden financial movements, and international connections with other criminal organizations gave a chilling dimension to our task. In those weeks, veiled threats began to arrive. Anonymous calls, disturbing messages, the constant feeling of being watched. Everything became part of an ever-growing tense atmosphere. My colleagues felt that way too. But it was in those moments that I realized the importance of supporting each other as a team, strengthening trust and commitment. We knew we could be alone, facing a dark power, but also that giving up was not an option, not when we had the real possibility of saving lives, of stopping enormous harm. During my walks leaving the lab, I observed the city as if seeing a blurred face, a crowd unaware of the danger, a reality unfolding with apparent normality, but beneath which an invisible risk throbbed. That contrast filled me with a mix of despair and determination. The old man's death, with his calm eyes and that small sign on his clothing, was a perfect metaphor for what we faced. A world where the fragile and the hidden could change everything. And there lay our responsibility, to transform uncertainty into certainty, darkness into light. I never forgot that night, reviewing the last reports, the city asleep, and feeling how every new piece of data made me stronger and, at the same time, more vulnerable. Science was not just a method, but a way of listening to those who could no longer speak. The investigation became more than a technical process. It turned into a mission, an act of respect for life and justice. And that commitment, forced by tragedy and fueled by tenacity, was the engine that drove me forward despite everything. I knew this case would not end soon, that there were still pieces to find, secrets to uncover, and dangers to face. But I also understood that in forensics, as in life, patience and attentiveness are powerful weapons. The small sign that no one expected had opened the door, and behind that door was a complex world worth exploring and confronting. Thus, with every step, with every detail, I learned that it's not just about solving a crime, but about listening to those silent voices that demand justice and truth. The story went on, and so did I. Because in this fight for clarity and protection of the innocent, there is no room for surrender. And on that path full of shadows, I found a certainty that light can always find its way, even in the darkest corners. What happened next was unlike anything I had experienced before in so many years working in forensics. We had been chasing shadows, pursuing signals so faint they barely seemed like whispers. But now, suddenly, those shadows began to take concrete shapes, becoming tangible threats staring us straight in the face. The first thing I noticed was a change in the nephew's behavior. It was clear he was not going to remain a passive observer in this story. Despite his evasions, there was a moment when his movements ceased to be just calculated steps to keep silent. There was carelessness, an involuntary leak that gave us an unexpected clue. The key lay in the network of contacts that seemed to open up without his intention. It was through an intercepted call, brief and apparently trivial, but laden with ominous weight. A cell phone poorly turned off, a voice whispering a name, a number, an address, and so, without knowing why or how, the labyrinth we were trapped in began to show an exit, but not an easy one. It was a path full of dangers, places where the law twisted and became confused with fear and corruption. What came next was a series of surprises that kept us on edge. It turned out that the lethal substance was not only a direct threat to the health of those who consumed it or came into contact with it, but had also been used as an instrument of manipulation in the broadest sense, to extort, pressure, and now I also understood to intimidate inconvenient witnesses. The elderly man, our first unwitting patient, might not have been just an accidental victim, but a link in a much darker chain. That revelation hit us hard. It became clear that behind the death there was a deliberate intent to silence, perhaps to prevent something even bigger from being uncovered. And then I understood why the nephew seemed trapped in an unbearable dilemma. He was not only a possible conspirator, but also someone who may have been threatened, manipulated, or even used without fully realizing it. The layers of this story kept multiplying, and the pressure became unbearable because every answer brought with it new questions. Every certainty opened a gap through which new shadows slipped in. I reviewed the reports again, searching for a pattern that might have escaped us, when I found something that had almost gone unnoticed. A subtle code embedded in an almost forgotten chemical report, referring to a project called Eclipse. Curiously, that name matched a handwritten note found in the clandestine laboratory, right next to a series of numbers we hadn't deciphered the first time. That word, Eclipse, seemed like an internal code, the mark of an operation hidden beneath layers of secrecy and silence. With this new clue, we expanded the investigation and stopped to speak with experts in biochemistry and technology, try to understand what Eclipse really meant. We discovered it was not just another name for an abandoned project, but an experimental program combining elements of biotechnology with artificial intelligence. It was an advancement aiming, in theory, to control cellular processes at unprecedented levels, but which also had the potential to be a genetic manipulation tool with far less noble purposes. The terror of that idea seeped into us because we were facing a technology so powerful that, in the wrong hands, it could transform not only individual lives, but entire populations. If the substance we found was derived from that project, then we were facing an invisible weapon, an agent that didn't just sicken or kill, but, on a larger scale, could control or coerce behavior at will. That possibility, which might seem like science fiction to anyone else, was beginning to feel like our new battlefield in Santiago, beyond the laboratory and documents. The investigation even took us to neighborhoods and communities where we had detected an unexplained increase in respiratory and neurological illnesses. It was evident that many cases previously labeled as simple common medical problems were directly related to the silent circulation of that substance. The city, with its innocent hustle and bustle, was a double victim. Hurting in its people and hurting in its soul, unknowingly poisoned. I shared this with my team during the long nights when we barely allowed ourselves to close our eyes. We talked about the responsibility we had toward a population that, without knowing it, was walking among a poison far beyond individual harm. And that feeling disturbed me because I knew that no matter how much we wanted to hasten justice, the slowness of the process, bureaucracy, and the weight of politics would make this battle last longer than any of us were willing to endure. However, surrender was not an option, and persistence became our silent mantra. One early morning, when exhaustion was undeniable, I received an unexpected call that changed the direction of our investigation. It was an encrypted message sent by someone who seemed willing to collaborate but demanded absolute anonymity. They sent us an attached file, a recording that, according to the information, came from someone very close to the core of the Eclipse project. The audio was fragmented and interrupted, but what we heard was chilling. Voices discussing not only the nature of the substance, but also a plan to expand it and use it as a tool for social control under the pretext of public health security. This leak opened a terrifying window into the true scope of the problem. The Eclipse project was not simply a completed and abandoned experiment, but a mechanism planned to be activated at specific times, with objectives beyond ethics and that, who knows, might even be linked to power interests so great they didn't reach the visible hands we could touch. All this made me feel both small and enormous. Small in the face of the vastness of conspiracy, enormous in the responsibility to bring light to that abyss. It was not long before the pressure became unbearable. We knew that our exposure and progress put us in the crosshairs. We received veiled warnings, and on one occasion, a colleague's vehicle was violently rammed. A clear message to back off. That signal almost paralyzed us for a moment, but also reinforced a deep conviction. We were now closer than ever to dismantling that network. With all these elements, the labyrinth began to turn into a puzzle we could piece together bit by bit. The nephew, finally and in an unexpected surrender, agreed to cooperate under certain conditions. His confession revealed not only his involvement, but also the existence of an inner circle within the university that, having lost all ethics, had allowed Eclipse to be distorted and used for criminal purposes. That dark group not only distributed the substance, but was behind machinery to silence those who tried to report it, using the drug as retaliation. What seemed impossible for our reality, a science fiction scenario, became tangible. Every name, every contact, every old letter and handwritten note we recovered formed a mosaic of deep corruption where science had been perverted and cartelized. And the further we advanced, the clearer it became that we were here not only to solve a case, but to stop a sick system that threatened the safety and lives of thousands. However, amid all this progress, the weight of uncertainty did not disappear. We knew the substance was still out there, operating, floating in the air, or arriving in silent doses into unsuspecting hands. The population was an invisible battlefield where the enemy could be in a friend's embrace, in the frantic pulse of a street corner, or in the muted silence of a common medical consultation. I encourage my colleagues to hold on to hope, because those flashes of truth are our vaccine against despair. In this fight, I learned something vital that I want to share. No matter how complex or enormous the threat, obsessive attention to detail, empathy for the victims, and integrity in the pursuit of justice are powerful weapons to crack open the darkness. Each of those little signals others ignore are clues, are stories, are cries that science and care can translate into concrete actions. Although the end of this story is yet unwritten and the battle continues, I am certain our effort is not in vain. The search for truth, though permeated by shadow, is a heroic task, a silent struggle many do not see, but which sustains a hope of a safer tomorrow. And that understanding, that responsibility, and that will to never give up are the light we must reach, and I hope everyone who hears this story can find in their own struggles. Because at the end of the day, it is not just about the lifeless body I examined, nor the substance we detected. It is about understanding that behind every case there are lives, communities, and the need to listen to those voices, no matter how small or hidden they may be. That in the tiny lies the great, in the unnoticed, the key to saving ourselves. And with that thought, I close this part of the narration, hoping that somewhere, someone may be listening and join that silent fight, which is, in essence, a fight for life. The unexpected continued its course, and soon we realized that each advance dragged us toward a deeper abyss. As the nephew recounted what he knew, what we initially believed to be a limited confession, a much darker and more intertwined panorama opened before us than any of us could have imagined. The network sustaining the substance, that invisible and lethal drug, was not just a small segment of a derailed project, but an organized web with connections reaching very high layers of our society. There was no clear line between science, power, and crime. It was a blurred yet deadly map where seemingly ordinary people had become key pieces in a corrupt machine. That early morning, after hours of interrogation and reviewing piece after piece of evidence, I remembered I had left a laboratory report open on my desk. There, among the technical information, one detail had caught my attention, but I hadn't given it enough weight. A sheet with encrypted notes, perhaps the chemist's notes who worked directly on the Eclipse project. I recalled the whispered phrase, "The real change will come with a second phase." That second phase no one seemed to want to name, but that resonated in all our suspicions like a shadow yet to materialize. I decided it was time to look into that second phase, to find out what was being cooked in the corners where power and a total lack of scruples met without most people knowing. We spent weeks making connections, gathering data, and gradually one of the investigators found an anomaly in the imports of chemical products, drugs that supposedly came from medical research, but in practice disappeared into the darkness of clandestine warehouses linked to labs filled with sophisticated equipment. That put us on highest alert. Someone was not only producing the substance, but planning to multiply its reach, distributing it systematically. With that certainty, the pressure escalated. The nights grew longer, the coffee more bitter, and the fear more palpable. I cannot deny that there were moments when I felt exhaustion was the final word, that the strength to continue was running out in the cold solitude of the office, and the echo of phones that never stopped ringing with bad news. One night, reviewing official documents leaked by an anonymous source with access inside the university, I noticed a confidential contract referring to medical institutions abroad, with plans for supposed clinical trials that it was now clear were just a facade. The substance was being exported, and with it, the threat was globalizing. It was then that this reality took on a more conspiratorial than scientific tone. We realized that Eclipse was not just a local or national program. It was something bigger, part of an international scheme with clearly dark purposes. I realized that we were not only thinking about the health or justice of a single person or one corner of the world, but fighting against a nightmare that, if not stopped, could transform the very nature of human freedom. Each dose from that dark laboratory was an invisible chip planted in society, a hidden card for anyone who wanted to bend wills under the pretext of protecting them. As we delved deeper, the clandestine lab revealed technical surprises beyond imagination. We found that the drug had the capacity not only to affect physically but also chemically alter behavior and cognitive processes, modifying patterns of fear and obedience. It was a brutal violation of the human essence, a direct manipulation backed by the most advanced science and applied with cold criminal machinery. That explained many things that had seemed disconnected before: witness disappearances, deaths disguised as accidents, inexplicable silences around the affected. The magnitude of the project put us in a game where the pieces seemed invisible but whose moves affected millions. The frustrating thing was that nothing was done in broad daylight, and what had for decades been taken for granted as scientific progress now appeared as a disguise for a network of control where ethical scientists were crushed, displaced, or silenced. That silent war within academia was as cruel as the one fought in police corridors or on the streets. We were witnesses not only to the breaking of the law, but also to the fracture of the values sustaining our society. It was at that point that we received confirmation the substance was already distributed in some vulnerable sectors of the city. It was not accidental or isolated. It was a chemical invasion, a strand of poison with an innocent appearance circulating freely with dark objectives. Hospitals began reporting strange cases, with symptoms that didn't quite fit classical diagnoses. The victims, mostly older people or with chronic illnesses, were invisible to the system, and their accelerated deterioration was a silent result of our fight against time and corruption. The effects we observed went beyond medicine. They touched the very fiber of the social fabric. Families destroyed by accelerated dementia, individuals turned into shadows of themselves, entire communities unknowingly living with the effect of an agent designed to divide, weaken, and subjugate. In that ethical and moral void, every step we took was a race against a relentless machine fighting to remain hidden and active, to prevent justice from approaching and truth from coming to light for all. But we were not the only ones feeling that pressure. The nephew, who at first seemed a simple, fearful pawn, began to show different signs. In one of the few times we met face-to-face outside the rigid environment of an interrogation, he revealed his true condition. He was not only a forced witness, but someone who had lived for years in constant fear, threatened not only by the criminality behind Eclipse, but by a feeling of institutional abandonment. His refusal to remain passive was the spark that allowed us to enter areas that had seemed inaccessible before. With his help, we managed to infiltrate a small group of investigators within that dark academic network. Men and women willing to risk everything to reveal the truth. Clandestine meetings, encrypted messages, and evidence appearing in unexpected places were our hope. But more than that, they were a brutal reminder. The enemy is real, watches us, and will not hesitate to destroy anyone in their way. One colleague was followed to his home. Another suffered legal harassment to discredit him. And those reprisals aimed not only to intimidate, but to erase traces. During that time, I understood that the challenge was also a battle against misinformation and collective fear. We couldn't simply go against a substance and its production. We had to fight for social awareness, to awaken society unaware of the lurking threat. The industry of misinformation and apathy was as powerful as a poison itself. And that battle was perhaps the hardest. We found many institutions that should protect chose to look away, silence, or minimize the problem to avoid scandal or loss of prestige. What for some might have seemed a distant story or an implausible thriller was, for us, the harsh reality we faced every day. And that reality told us the light at the end of the tunnel was still far away. But every small spark we managed to ignite was a victory, a hope for those who could be saved from that silent fate. The Eclipse substance was a huge shadow, but it was also vulnerable to the attentive human eye, to the tireless effort of the small group refusing to drop their weapons. And that group was us, united by truth, justice, and the responsibility to protect lives. I understood with unbearable clarity. It wasn't about defeating a single enemy, but resisting a system that sought to make us accomplices through our silence. That's why those of us on the front line, though tired and threatened, shared an unbreakable bond. The certainty that justice is the only effective medicine against the corrosion of the social soul. The night we decided to make public the audio leak, and the connections we had uncovered was memorable. Gathered in a small, airy meeting with journalists, activists, and allies, I felt every word was a bullet fired at the wall of impunity. But I also felt fear, because we knew that opening that Pandora's box could accelerate reprisals, and the enemy would not hesitate to protect its secrets with any violence necessary. Yet at that moment, fear was left behind, and the conviction that we were doing the right thing prevailed. As I listened to questions, murmurs, and growing attention, I realized this story was no longer just ours, but the whole city's, for all the people who deserve to know the extent of this invisible battle. And although the substance continued its silent dance in some sectors, we had broken the silence, disturbing the apparent calm that kept that criminal network functioning with impunity. That was a crucial first step that no invisible virus could stop. Still, the nightmare was not over. We knew the CLIPS project could be activated at any moment, that new and worse chapters could be written if we didn't act fast and with the necessary force. Intimidation did not cease, uncertainty weighed heavily, but something now shone with unexpected strength: citizen mobilization. Social organizations, affected patients, and entire families raised their voices, demanding answers, protection, and transparency. The story I began telling, the story of an elderly man and a small sign on his clothing, was the center and symbol of a bigger struggle. Every battle won in courts, every lab closed, every infiltrated cell dismantled was a glimmer of hope. But true victory, I knew, would not come without first facing the darkest parts of our own humanity. The Eclipse story not only speaks of twisted science, but of people who, amid that corruption, gave up their ethics, who used others' hope to build their power, and of a system that sometimes protects the guilty instead of the victims. That's why, although today I can share this narration with a mix of relief and cautious optimism, I know the fight is far from over. Because those small signals no one had seen, those shadows we have now made visible, remain there, challenging us not to drop our guard, to listen, investigate, protect, and resist. Every inert body, every inexplicable symptom is one more voice in the silent chorus demanding justice and truth. That is why this story continues, and it is our responsibility to keep the light on so that abyss does not swallow us. When I finished telling this to a close friend, he said something that still resonates with me. "Ricardo, what you do is not just forensics. It's illuminating the truth where others want darkness." And that, ultimately, is what I try to do every day. No matter how small the sign, how unnoticed a detail, behind it is a life, a story, and a world where justice deserves a chance. And so, with that conviction in this story I share with you, I leave the door open so those who listen don't forget, even in the darkest darkness, there's always a light waiting to be found. What came next was a spiral of conflicts that challenged everything I thought I knew about justice and ethics in forensic medicine. Every clue, every document we found, seemed to open a door to an even darker passageway. Working with the nephew was key, not only because of the information he provided, but because his fears and courage painted a clear human portrait amidst that cold and systematic web. With him, and with our group infiltrating the shadows of the academic system, we penetrated spaces where no one expected us. Secret meetings, laboratories hidden behind legal facades, and rooms where science prostituted itself to the highest bidder. On one of those endless nights when exhaustion threatened to consume me, I received an encrypted message that led us to a digital archive hidden on a foreign server. There were the missing pieces of evidence, records of transactions, communications between high-ranking officials and compromised scientists, and even videos of experiments where the humanity of the victims was barely discernible behind the cold statistics of progress. That substance, Eclipse, was not just a chemical agent. It was a symbol of the most brutal betrayal, a large-scale manipulation that eroded human dignity and defied any morality one could profess. As we delved deeper, We discovered that the network had tentacles that reached not only public health, but also politics and the economy. We were talking about million-dollar contracts, bought silences, and machinery operating under protective veil of secrecy and bureaucracy. There were those who had decided that the ends justified the means, no matter how many lives were lost or how many consciences were shattered in the process. The dilemma was brutal. To go on and risk our careers, reputations, and even our lives, or to remain silent and let injustice take its course. The decision was clear, although the price was high. The toll was unbearable. Danger lurked with terrifying stealth at every step. I remember vividly the day one of our investigators, a young man committed and full of ideals, disappeared without a trace after reporting a clandestine meeting. That absence felt like a dagger in the soul, but also like an urgent call to action. We could not allow fear to paralyze us. The battle was no longer just scientific or police work. It was a humanitarian struggle, a race against those who wanted to silence our voice and erase our existence. We became shadows walking in the darkness, always vigilant, always looking for a crack through which the truth could emerge. With the public leak, something began to change in society. Ordinary people slowly woke from that imposed lethargy. Questions started to multiply. Demands echoed to the streets, and although the criminal network tried to respond with disinformation campaigns, the power of the truth was an unstoppable torrent. But the darkness struck back with renewed forces, threats, persecutions, and a constant feeling of being watched. Every night, before closing my eyes, I mentally reviewed the list of people with whom I had shared information, living with a latent fear that anyone could become the next victim. However, we also discovered something no one expected: humanity's resilience. Amid fear and intimidation, there were gestures of solidarity, altruistic decisions, and a network of support that grew beyond the oppressor's control. Families who had once suffered in silence began to unite, demanding protection and justice. Public hospital doctors, critical academics, and social activists formed a united front that, although vulnerable, radiated a light no lethal substance could extinguish. That collective strength gave us the energy to continue, to not let the sacrifice of those who had fallen be in vain. In those critical months, I came to understand something fundamental. The true enemy does not only reside in the toxic substance or those who manufacture it. The real challenge is against indifference, moral blindness, and a complicit silence that allows such hidden projects to continue existing. Justice is not an abstract concept nor a distant cause. It is a fabric of small daily actions, of people who choose to listen to those muted voices, those tiny signals no one wants to see. That elderly man with his small sign on his clothing was a spark. But the fight is for all those who have no voice, for every body that tells a story, for every truth that refuses to be buried. Although the story I share could go on for hours, what I can tell you today is that no evil is too great, nor any network too dark, to withstand the watchful gaze and the will of those who fight for justice. Within each of us is a light that, when lit, can illuminate even the most hidden and remote places. Never underestimate the power of a small sign, because in those tiny marks lies the key to unraveling truths others will want to keep buried. In the end, I am left with certainty that has become my mantra. Science is a powerful tool, but only if used with values and humanity. Life, with all its imperfections and fragilities, deserves that respect. And although the shadow of eclipse still lingers in some corners, I know it is not invincible. Because as long as there are those willing to look, to listen, and to act, there will always be hope. I want this story to serve as a call to all, to open our eyes to those small signs, so that we do not allow fear to silence our voices. So, my friend, if you ever feel that the weight of injustice is too much, remember this tale. Remember the elderly man and his invisible sign, and a small but determined group who refuse to ignore it, because that is what our work and our life are about. Turning the invisible into visible, transforming silence into speech, and holding a light that no dark power can extinguish. No matter how dark the path may seem, there will always be a light waiting to be found, and I will be here vigilant, searching for that sign no one else noticed.